Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron. I want to thank you for taking time to join me for this presentation that I call the most important UFO event in history. I have done this for 50 years, and I have seen most of the major events that have happened. And I say what I'm going to show you today is, to me, without a doubt, the most important story that has ever occurred. It's also going to be part of a upcoming book that's I will be putting out called The 12 Paranormal Gifts. It'll be chapter 12. I got a message, whether I made it up or I got it from someone, that basically I was told not to worry. We know how to land the plane. And what this sort of indicated immediately to me was that the phenomena, whatever it is, I call it the intelligence, has since at least 1895, 1896, 1897 been engaging us with some sort of mystery that they want us to figure. So what you have is 1896, 1897, you have beings flying around in wooden ships with propellers and balloons, and they're talking in rhymes and riddles and saying we come from above the clouds, and some people thought they were from Mars. And the point of that was they went away. The question is, if this was simply aliens getting here from another planet, did they fly the wooden ships across time and space and through the vacuum of time and space? And where did they go? Why did they leave? Then you have the Foo Fighters, which took place for about a year and a half during World War II. They came, then the Foo Fighters left. Then the Green Fireballs came. Where did the Foo Fighters go? Well, they were replaced by the Green Fireballs. Then the Green Fireballs went on in the late 1940s of the nuclear power and nuclear weapons factories, and then they went away. Then came the contactees that started a couple days after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb in November of 1952. The contactee phenomena starts. That goes on through the 1950s, and then they all go away. And then along come the Greys. Nancy Tremaine and her friend are taken on board. That's the first one a couple months before Betty and Barney Hill. And the Greys start. Then in 1980, the Reptilians start. Then the crop circles start. Then the cattle mutilations start. And then they stop. And the ground traces start. And the ground traces stop. And the ground traces have not occurred for 25 years. And you see this pattern of almost like they're turning the pages of a book and sort of never giving us anything. As Jim Semivan described it, they cajole you, they tease you, um, they lie to you, but they're never ever going to take you home to meet the family. The phenomena does this bizarre thing where it's creating awe and curiosity and forcing us to figure out the mystery. Some people maintain 1947, the Roswell case, was the most important story of all times. It was not. It was totally forgotten until 1980, when Bill Moore wrote the book, The Roswell Incident. And even today, we now know that there was incidents probably before Roswell. So Roswell was not even the first case. It just got a lot of publicity because of this book that Bill Moore wrote. And I maintain it is not the most important case. In fact, Roswell does not really even discuss all that much because nobody ever really unraveled the story of what happened and confirmed that this actually occurred. The 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. was the same thing. It was not really known for many, many years. It happened. It was a story for a couple of weeks. Then it sort of left the pages and it went away. The one that comes close to being the most important story is the Travis Walton abduction, which occurred in November of 1975. 1975 is very important. It's the year with the highest number of cattle mutilations. It is the year that I got involved. It is the year that Linda Howe got involved after her brother phoned her, helicopter pilot at Malmstrom Air Force Base, and told her there was UFOs over the nuclear missile silos. Bud Hopkins got dragged in 1975, and Stephen Greer did his first CE5 encounter in 1975. And in the Travis Walton abduction scenario, this was exactly the same time in late October, early November of 1975, when there was UFOs over the nuclear weapon storage areas at Malmstrom, Minot, Wurtsmith, and Loring Air Force Base along the Canadian-U.S. border. And Travis was taken right in the middle of these encounters with UFOs over the nuclear missile silos. The other thing that most people may not know is that Travis was gone for 4 or 5 nights, and this is the whole theory of wow. Why would they take him for 5 nights? And they took him for 5 nights, as I maintain, is because they wanted everybody to go, wow, that's not just an abduction. That's really how did they get him for 5 days? And the other thing about the Travis Walton incident that made it make it very important is that he was gone for 5 nights, and on every single one of those nights, if you look at the record, there was a UFO over a nuclear missile storage area or a nuclear weapons storage area on the northern border of Canada and the United States. Now, I started in 1975 with my incident. I wrote a book about it, and what was important to me at that point was to try to figure out who knew what I had seen. I knew I wasn't going to figure it out. I didn't have the answers. And I figured someone in the world has got to know what's going on. So I started this lifelong pursuit to find the highest level people that I could possibly find who might have answers to the UFO mystery. One of the key people that I listen to, I name a bunch of them. There's Lakatsky, there's the presidents, there's a number of people in the CIA. But one of the key people that I say that you've got to listen to is a guy by the name of Jim Semivan. I was the first to identify Jim Semivan in 2016. It's in my book, Managing Magic, in 2017. And Jim Semivan was a high-level official at the CIA, supposedly the equivalent of a two-star general. I say that everything that he says should be carefully paid attention to. I listen to everything he says 5 or 6 times. He's gotten at least 2 briefings. One was he tells us the story of scientists and official people from contractors who got him to get a room for 6 to 8 hours at the CIA, and they sat down with him after his experience and scared the shit out of him, according to what he said. And he also confirms that he has gotten a classified briefing. I was told by a guy by the name of Larry, people know who he is in Philadelphia, that the briefing he was briefed when he left the CIA. Jim Semivan has confirmed that he has classified briefing. We don't know at what level. He says he knows what the legacy programs are, and he basically knows more than you and I would know. So I say it's very important to listen to everything he says. The interview that inspired today's lecture on the most important story is an interview that was done by podcaster, YouTube host, James Ian Dolly. This is an interview that took place maybe a year ago, and it was during that interview James was asking him about his experience. Jim Semivan and his wife had an experience in 1992, 1993 with beings in the bedroom. He also describes the fact that before that incident took place, there was an invisible helicopter, a very loud helicopter over the house. He couldn't see it, but he could hear it very clearly. Nobody else heard it. So this is this very bizarre paranormal event that he got dragged into. And as you will see, I will maintain this is the most important story that has ever happened. So James is trying to get him to talk about this, and he basically says to him at one point, he says, "Was there any telepathy involved?" And that's when Jim says, yeah, that's the most important thing. He said, I was standing there with my wife, and there was this being behind me, and it had this guardian type thing going on about it. And it was at that point that I got the idea that this was possibly a spirit guide. And I started to look, and Chris Bledsoe had described the same thing, these beings behind him. He called them angelic beings that were telling him what to do. If you look at Phil Kinsella's story, he talks about these beings behind him. Um, I wrote the book called UFO Sky Pilots, where I have these 36 people who suddenly appear and tell me these stories about flying the craft. And I had one, his name was David. He was a U.S. Air Force retired colonel out of Los Angeles, tells exactly the same story. He said, I was standing on the craft. That's how it started. I'm standing on the craft, and there's a voice behind me. And I don't know if it's a human or it's an alien, whatever it is, but it's telling me, okay, go ahead and do it. And I said, I don't know what to do. And the voice says, you know what to do, just do it. And he put his hand on his panel. And that's when this whole story about flying the craft, that the craft is alive, it's conscious, and that people will touch the craft and they will become one with the craft, and whatever they think is what the craft will do. Well, this guy put his hands on the panel, but what I discovered later, after Lakatsky came forward and said that all UFO sightings were different, I suddenly realized that all the people had had the same story of being on the craft's alive, touch the craft, become one with the craft, fly the craft. But everybody did something different. Nobody did the same thing. Nobody touched the same thing. Everybody was touching something different. And so you have this story. So when uh, Jim talked about this, I immediately knew that there was this phenomena that's somebody behind. And even I had the experience in uh, a psychedelic. I did 27 high dose psychedelic experiences with psilocybin. I wrote up the first 15 in a book called The Psilocybin School. And in all those instances, I never saw anybody, but there was a voice. And it wasn't until I started to put this together that I suddenly realized this voice was probably behind me. It was instructing me, see this, see that, do this, do that. And I never saw anything, but I was definitely with somebody every single incident that I had. Now, Jim Semivan is very upset about his encounter. He calls it a human rights violation of the highest order, which made me wonder if the CIA does this kind of stuff and whether it's a human rights violation if the CIA is doing this in other countries. Um, he says he's still very angry about it. And he's talked about this experience a number of times, not in detail. But my question would be, who's the I that's asking the question? And I'll get into that in a minute in terms of who's the one that's having the bad experience. Um, Jim had marks on his body, and his wife had been injured with marks and no details whatever else. But this is not uncommon. This is actually very, very common. And the question is, like this one is a triangle. A lot of people will find triangles on their wrists, on their hands. These triangles will last for about 2 or 3 days, then they'll fade away. And the question is, would some alien come 100,000 light years across the universe to put triangles on people's arms? Like, what is the purpose of this? I maintain it is because when people like Jim or all these other people have the experience, it appears like a dream. Even the U.S. Air Force retired colonel told me, he said, it seemed like a dream. And I said, everybody thinks this is a dream. Just tell me what your experience was. So people have these encounters, and basically it's to uh, assure you when you wake up in the morning and say, that was a bizarre dream. Wow. And then you look at your hand and you realize, no, that wasn't a dream. That's really real. That's why they put the markings. Here's one from Lala Bright on her arm, triangle on her arm. Here's my friend Jim. Now, Jim, I had a lot of uh, experiences with him. He lives in the city where I am. And I asked him about this whole thing about the intelligence doing these weird things, what I call the theory of wow. They're doing weird things to make you think and to try to, it's all a big mystery and you can't figure it out. So I asked him, because he had marks on his body, and I asked him, I said, well, did they ever put your clothes on inside out backwards? He said, yeah, twice. You want a picture? And he actually sends me the photograph of the t-shirt. And of course, not only did they put it inside out and backwards, but as happens in a lot of cases, they put this pink fluid all over the shirt. And he gets excited by it. He sends it to Kathy Martin. Kathy Martin gets it analyzed. And of course, it's like everything else in the UFO world. It's very mysterious, but there are no answers. So they couldn't figure out what it was. But that's part of the mystery of this whole thing, that they are sort of dragging people along, and people are learning through awe and curiosity. Because if there's no awe and curiosity, there's no scientific investigation. You need to be curious before you will invest money to try to figure something out. Here's Jim experience he had where he had the Y cut in his top of his head. So Jim Semivan experience of these injuries um, is the same thing. It's basically when Jim showed me this, and he also had a cut up his leg, which disappeared right away. And then he said, "Why would they do this to me?" He was very angry, and I said, "Well, maybe they're trying to get a hold of you, and you didn't pay attention." So they said, "Let's give him something that he can't deny." Now later on, and Jim actually tells the story, and I won't get into it today. He gets cured of cancer, and this cut in that forehead. Actually, there's a doctor that gets involved and sees the cut, and um, he actually starts to see it in a total different light after he gets this cure as to the fact that he is actually in contact and communicating. And he had 5 terabytes of material. He was filming all the time. He had cameras going. He had inside cameras, outside cameras. Now, here's where Jim talks about this fact. He said, there was one element when I was standing with my wife. I felt very strongly something behind me with a guardian type of thing going on. And as I said, when I did my book, I realized there's other people described the same thing, having these people behind them. I actually went once I discovered this pattern of this intelligence behind the person telling them what to do, where they can't look behind them or they don't look behind them and they just hear this voice. I actually went to Whitley Strieber and I said, Whitley, you're on the craft a couple of times. I said, do you ever have anybody behind you that was you couldn't see that was telling you what to do? And his reply was all the time. So this is a pattern that people will describe, and it's just sort of appeared in the last couple of years, almost like they want this part of the story told, that there may be this whole whether it's a spirit guide or whatever it is, but it changes the whole aspect of if this is a spirit guide, then what's really going on. Now, Jim Semivan actually referred to this book in another interview he just did, Michael Newton, Destiny of Souls. And this is important because this is where the idea comes from. When James Ian Dolly got this report from Jim Semivan that there was a being standing behind him and telling and sort of telepathically telling him stuff, I said to James, contact him back and ask him, was it on the right side or on the left side? Because if you look at uh, the whole thing with Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, written by Michael Newton, he will describe this soul guide, and I'll get to it in a second. So the whole thing is, I mean, if this is a soul guide, then you have an abduction experience that the person may be very fearful in the front, and that's the I. The I is the ego. The ego is into fear. The ego is terrified. And of course, if there's a higher self or a soul guide in behind, like on the roller coaster, the soul guide knows exactly what's going on, is all excited about this event. So it depends which I is complaining about the abduction. Is it the ego or is it the higher self? Now, Jim has, because I say this is related to ego, he has amulets, he has rosaries, he has a mezuzah on his door, he has locked doors, he has the lights on. This is all fear. This is all left brain ego, and that's all fine. We live in the world, and our egos control things. But when you people start to understand what's going on, you see that their attitude changes, and I'll get to that in a bit. Jim said he was already spiritual, so he didn't think that really anything had changed. And I say, well, basically, everybody thinks they're spiritual. Even like the people who flew into the World Trade Center with the planes actually thought they were spiritual. Everybody thinks they're spiritual. Everybody thinks they're saving the world. So I don't think that's the important event. Um, uh, he made an important point, Jim, when he talked about. He said experiences are the voyagers in the expansion for evolution in consciousness, and I think that gets more to the idea of what is this phenomena about. That it's got to do with consciousness. It's more than extraterrestrials. Now, when you get the extraterrestrials, if you take the free survey, which was 4,200 people, and you have the over what it was, well over 1,000 people answered the question. 54% said that they had gotten a spiritual message. So there is this connection, and I basically will say that when it comes down to the end result, this is going to be an ontological, spiritual kick in the groin for a lot of people who are playing the nuts and bolts game of thinking this is just technology. And if you go to Lukatsky, he even hints at this. James Lukatsky, who ran the DIA program, he describes the fact that there was a craft and they got inside the craft, and then he said, and there was no engine. And then he paused and he said, so what are we really dealing with here? And he's giving the indication this may not be what people think it is. It may be much more complex. Now, here's the important part that sort of gave me the realization of this Jim Semivan event being the most important event. He said, I didn't learn anything. What in God's name were they doing? So Leo Sprinkle is a longtime experiencer, and he stated that the different experiencers had different views of it based upon their belief systems. And Kit Green has also mentioned this as well, who was a CIA guy who was the control officer for the remote viewing program. Sprinkle said people who have a view of reincarnation seem to have the good experiences. People who don't believe in reincarnation or how it applies to the experience are more likely to have negative experiences. So if we see the experience as just here and now, it's a random event, I just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's me, there's the ego, the me, and then there's the other, the separation, me versus the other. And I'm the good guy, they're the bad guys. Then you have this situation where people get into fear, and that happens in psychedelic experience. I can guarantee you that. And it also happens in near death experiences where people don't want to let go, they don't want to surrender the ego, and they fight, and they have these sort of very traumatic experiences. So this goes back to this whole thing now. This is the important part. This is another interview that James got and gave. And one of the other people who was on the call was John Ramirez. Now, John Ramirez was a high-level CIA analyst who retired. He was also an experiencer who actually flew the craft. He's in my book on flying the craft. And at one point during that interview, this is where the realization came to me how important this experience was. John Ramirez gets to ask a question. He said, Jim, he said, in the last couple of years, there have been a whole series of events, almost like this stuff was building up. And how come this all happened now? And we went from nothing to suddenly we got the Senate, and we got people all interested. And it's no longer the Rodney Dangerfield thing of I get no respect. Suddenly everything changed. And of course, Jim Semivan pointed out quite clearly, and everybody in the field, I don't think is going to deny this, the most important event that changed everything was the New York Times article. Now, how does that fit into Jim Semivan? Well, let me explain. This is the question that John asked. There's a rush of information in the last couple of years. What's causing this to happen? Now, as I said, I identified Jim Semivan as early on because I was dealing with Chris Bledsoe. Now, Chris Bledsoe, I knew him going back. We had a major event together in 2013. In 2016, I was talking to him. This is a year before To the Stars got involved and set up the To the Stars Academy. And he was talking to me about the fact that the big man, who is Jim, he called him the big man, Jim Semivan. He said to me, he said, high-level officials are going to come forward, and they're going to say UFOs exist, and they're going to force disclosure. This is 2016. So when Hillary lost the election, I immediately phoned Chris, and I said, or I texted him, I said, Chris, so what's going to happen now? Is it over? He said, no, it's bigger than ever. They're still going ahead. They're still going to do it. And this is the thing, is that Jim gets involved in this. And here's where we start. Would Jim Semivan have gotten involved if he had not had that experience in 1992, 1993? This is the key. So he has the experience in 1992, 1993. Then he has this many hours meeting at the CIA about the encounter. It briefed in 2008 when he left the CIA. He meets Elizondo. He actually states in interviews that he was in contact with Elizondo in 2014, and he was sort of helping out as a consultant to ATIP in 2014. So you got to remember, this is long before the New York Times article, long before Tom DeLonge. He's already in contact with Elizondo. He went to see and the question is, if he had not had the experience in 1992, would he have gone and met Elizondo and started to be a consultant to the UFO stuff that was happening at ATIP? Absolutely not. He had to have the experience. Then he went to see Tom DeLonge in 2016. Tom DeLonge's book came out, and Kit Green gave a heads up to Jim Semivan that there was this guy who seemed to have material that appeared might be classified. Where was this guy getting? So Jim Semivan contacted Tom DeLonge. They had this a meeting in a hotel room, and they went through this whole thing about where'd you get this material or whatever. And he joins forces with Tom DeLonge. Would he have gone and done that with Tom DeLonge in 2016 if he did not have the experience in 1992? Then he introduces Elizondo to DeLonge. After he meets DeLonge, he meets him. Then the most important thing is Jim Semivan goes to the three-letter agencies with a warning. And he says to the three-letter agencies, you guys can't get it out. We are going to drop this thing. We are going to get this out. We are going to force disclosure. We're not going to release classified material, but we're going to let you go. And they said, Godspeed, keep us informed. They didn't care. Go ahead and do it as long as you don't have classified material. So it was actually Jim Semivan who is behind all the disclosure that's happening today. He's the guy that set up the meeting in 2016, 17 with the New York Times. It happened October the 4th. Have I got it here? Yeah, it happened October the 4th at the Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City in Virginia. Um, Elizondo resigned in the morning. It's October the 4th. In the afternoon, the meeting took place. They had flown Leslie Kean in from New York into Washington, and Putoff was there. Mellon was there, and Mellon was brought in by Jim Semivan, and Mellon goes after Congress. So Jim Semivan was behind that as well by bringing Mellon in. I was on the same Coast to Coast show with Mellon in 2016, and he was maintaining at that point there is no UFO cover up. If there had been a UFO cover up, I would have known. So he didn't know until he got briefed by Jim Semivan. Jim Semivan brings him in, and that's when the whole congressional thing starts. Again, we go back. Would this meeting have taken place with Leslie Kean if Jim Semivan had not had that experience in 1992? Absolutely not. The people who are involved are the people who have these experiences, and he gets down the rabbit hole like the rest of us, and you can't leave it alone. And he starts to pursue, like I did, trying to figure out what happened to me, what happened to my sighting, who knew. And Jim Semivan did the same thing. So he has this meeting October the 4th. A week later, they go, all these guys, Elizondo, Mellon, Justice, Jim Semivan, and they have the news conference to the stars, and then they give the story to the New York Times, and the New York Times does the story that is fed to them by Jim Semivan and company. And the point is that if there had not been a New York Times article, none of this would have happened. You never would have heard about ATIP because ATIP was exposed by the New York Times. You never would have heard about the government had a UFO program. None of that would have gone public. It was the New York Times that broke it, but the story was fed by Jim Semivan, and Jim Semivan would not have gone down this route if he had not had the experience. This is a New York Times study, December of 2017, and that's when everything changed. Piles of new people came in. Suddenly it was permissible to talk about UFOs in the hallways of the Pentagon. People could talk about it, and they still played the game that, UFOs exist. We don't know what's causing it, which I think is basically true. And it all starts with this one article that changes everything in ufology. That's the big story, but it was the bigger story was the fact that this story, the New York Times story, would not have happened if Jim Semivan had not had beings that went into his bedroom and rang his bell and got him going. So there's the answer that Jim wanted to know. Why did they do this? Because they wanted him to force disclosure. They wanted him. That was his. And the Michael Newton thing that Jim Semivan knows about, Jim will probably say, no, he doesn't believe that. He knows, he's talked about it. He believed that this was not planned. But this goes back to the whole thing is when you get the whole Michael Newton stuff about the life between lives, that a lot of the stuff that's happening is planned, that we plan to do this kind of stuff. Jim was also behind helping to get these with Mellon, getting these DVDs out that had the video. You never would have heard of Nimitz. People say Nimitz is the biggest story. Nimitz was broken by Jim Semivan feeding it to the New York Times. That's how that story. So that's a secondary story. The big story is the encounter that Jim Semivan had that forced him to go down this road. Then again, we have the congressional stuff that started. None of the congressional stuff would have started. We'd still be back in 1979 or 2017, believing that the government doesn't have a UFO study. It's all nonsense. It's all weather balloons and stuff like that. All this congressional stuff admitting that yes, UFOs exist and trying to force testimony out, and the idea that there's bodies and crafts being confirmed and all that kind of stuff. None of that would have happened. You needed the New York Times article, which the initiator of that, I maintain, was Jim Semivan. Gresh, the same thing. Gresh would not have come forward because there would have been no ATIP or UAP task force that he would have been associated with. None of that would have happened. And again, it comes down to this idea that the higher self knows what's going on, and it forces the lower self, even though the lower self gets scared, doesn't know what's going on, is upset about things. That's what they told me at the very beginning. Don't worry, we know how to land a plane. The higher self knows exactly what they're doing. They may have done this disclosure on 1,000 different planets, and this was how they forced this out. Everything changed in 2017 with that article. It's a whole different world. I've been in it for 50 years. I never thought it would happen. And anybody who's been in it a long time will identify with me that this was an absolute shocker when this whole thing changed. And suddenly it was in the consciousness that UFOs were real. And now let's try to figure out what it is. So people, a lot of people will maintain that this is not true. So I'll give you a couple of examples of the fact that a lot of this may be planned before birth. This is the book, best-selling book by Sherry Wild. Sherry Wild's experience was 1,000 times more dramatic, more depressing, more. If you read her book, you bring tears to your eyes. She was absolutely traumatized her entire life over this event, and she calls it the forgotten promise. That she had made a promise to come into the world to do this, and when she finally realized what it was, she wrote the book, and then she's going to do the movie, and now she sees it completely different. She's no longer the victim. She actually believes that she comes from another civilization, a higher uh, uh, entity or consciousness or dimension, and that she had agreed to come to the world to present this message. And now they're working on a movie of her case. But if you want to see a very traumatic experience that she has, she talks about some of the stuff that she did that trying to get out of it and trying to stop it. She was absolutely traumatized by this whole event. So this is an idea that this is events that we may have agreed to. This is one that I have told a number of times now. This is the story of Mike Cleland, trying to figure out with him, his trying to deny that he had been abducted and you didn't really know, and he was going through depression in his life and stuff like this, and then has this experience where he is sleeping on the side of the road in Utah, and suddenly he's out of his body and above this craft, and he goes into the crafting. And this idea where there's a gray suit on the wall, and he's in the gray suit, and he looks at himself, and I'm a gray now, and he's with these two other grays that go down the hall, and they go into this room where there's these beings, almost like the Michael Newton people going before the council, and these beings said, "It's time," and Mike said, "Time for what?" "It's time. It's time to get going." "Well, time for what?" And then they said, "You volunteered for this." He said, "I volunteered." "Volunteered for what?" And then they put it in his head. He said, "You never told me it's going to be like this. You never told me it's going to be this depressing," because he's spent his whole life fighting depression. And he moved from this situation where he was totally mystified, traumatized by the events that were happening in his life, and went from that to writing books. And 2 days after that experience with these beings, he started his first book on owls. So again, you have this idea that a lot of the events that we encounter are not chance. We like to believe that things are chance. This is sort of the old Newtonian, Darwinian idea that everything's happening by accident, that the 85 trillion cells in the human body are just accidentally there, and they're just accidentally staying together, and they're accidentally doing what they're supposed to do, and they die at the right time, and the new cells come on accidentally at the right time. And that was what Terence McKenna called the limit case for credulity. If you can believe that all this is happening by accident, what is there in the world that you can't believe? So what do we know for sure? Now I just added this part on because as I pointed out, I think Jim Semivan is a guy that everybody should listen to because he has got the briefings and he's thought about this. And I think he's as honest as the day is long. And I think he's very important to listen to. So here's some of the stuff. One of the things that Jim does talk about that I do have some disagreement, and I'll bring it up here, is the idea of orbs. He calls orbs the bad, they're bad news, and this is based upon one experience that I'll talk to. And this is an orb with me on the right, my assistant on the left, and we're in a field, and there's this orb thing where we all got cameras, digital cameras, and point and shoot cameras, and we're all filming, and someone gets this one with the orb. Well, it didn't eat me. It didn't do anything wrong. So, but there's this idea that comes out that these orbs are bad. It's particularly the blue ones, which were called the blue meanies. And I will remind people that Leo Sprinkle talks about the fact that he was getting material, that he could talk to his higher self, and that the material was coming from a blue light that was coming from him. So he was getting, so his was a positive blue light. Beta Andreasen talked about the fact that she had a blue orb that followed her around. She called it her guardian. It was guarding her. There's started a site on Facebook called Orbology, And on there, you'll see people posting orbs. This is from the Netherlands. One particular woman who gets blue orbs all the time. Blue orbs all over the place, and they don't eat people. They don't do. It's got to do with the idea that's talked about at Skinwalker Ranch by Brendan Fugel, that it's a reflective. Whatever you reflect into the phenomena will reflect back to you. It's not the orb, it's your attitude. Now here's Jim, the guy with the shirt that was inside out and backwards. This is his case, and I won't get into it, where he gets healed of lymph node cancer. He films this object, and this is a still shot from this object, a blue orb that enters his body. He films it going into his body, and he gets out of bed, and his lymph node cancer is completely gone. All the tumors are gone, and this is confirmed by medical records and his oncologist and stuff like that. So here again, we have a blue orb that is positive. Jim Semivan, actually, here's Chris Bledsoe, and Chris Bledsoe is famous for orbs. He basically maintains orbs as the bottom line to this whole thing. It's very key to the story. He has orbs. He sent me all sorts of photographs of orbs, and one of the ones, I don't know if I had the photograph, but there was actually, he's good friends with Jim Semivan. Jim Semivan went to him after Jim Semivan retired, and became close friends with Chris and wanted to know what Chris was being told. And there is one photograph, and I'm not sure if I have it, where Jim is standing by this tree. This is called the burning tree. I won't get into that story. It's a bizarre tree that is involved in the story. Jim is standing beside the burning tree, and these orbs all around him. And they asked him about the orbs, what he thought, and his comment was, "I hope they didn't follow me home." So he has this attitude that the orbs are not good things, whereas Chris Bledsoe says the orbs are good things. So it's this reflective thing. The idea of the orbs being bad comes from a story that comes out of the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon story. And I'll tell you the full story, not just the story they tell you. So they have these three armed forces guys, special forces guys. They're armed. They're on the ranch, and of course they're playing Hunt the Skinwalker. We're gonna dominate this phenomena. We're gonna figure it out. And they have this encounter where I heard that they basically sort of got told, "You are not welcome. Leave. You're not welcome." And they run into this sort of a force, and they're totally petrified. This sense of fear, which Chris Bledsoe has experienced, getting close to these objects. I've experienced that in 1976. I had that same sort of thing, which lasted for a couple of minutes and then instantly disappeared. And it's this sense of fear. And these guys were so scared that they refused to go back to the ranch, and they left these special forces guys. But again, you have these guys that are looking at it in terms of war, in terms of technology, in terms of dominating, me versus you separation. And they go back, and their story is told that they lose the money. The ATIP loses the money, and then they give a briefing. And this is where the blue orb thing, so the blue meanie thing comes in. So they give this on the same night. It was Axelrod's kid who gets bombarded by these orbs in the middle of the night. And Jim actually said, "Well, why would they do this to this kid? This is horrible." And what you got to remember is you got to see it as reflective. What was happening at the same time? What was happening at the same time is two guys they'd gone in to brief two high-ranking officials in the security um, the security agency, and they wanted the money. So they had painted this very horrible picture of what was going on at Skinwalker Ranch, that this is a threat. And that's the whole idea. You use the weapons of mass destruction stuff, that this is terrible. We're going to all get killed unless we do something here. You need to spend money. And they were trying to get money. And they scared these guys in Homeland Security so bad that these guys couldn't sleep that night. Well, the same night, this is when the kid was attacked by these blue orbs. And it was, so you have this reflective quality that they built up this sort of negative energy by putting out this briefing. The other thing that happened the same night was at Skinwalker Ranch. Colm Kelleher was actually called in to Homestead 2, that there was this very sort of dark incident occurring at Homestead 2, and he was called in. It happened exactly the same night. So you see this whole idea of reflective, that you have the hitchhiker phenomena. So people call the hitchhiker phenomena evil. The hitchhiker phenomena happens all the time. It happens in the good experiences, it happens in the bad experience. It happens in ghost experiences. I have my friend Ron Johnson I even have the photograph where he's in gets a photograph of this crypt where he's yelling at the in the cemetery for something to come out of the crypt, and this black thing starts to come out of the crypt, and he actually gets a photograph of this thing before he disassembles a camera and goes racing off. And he stated that thing followed him through 3 different properties for 5 years. The hitchhiker is very, very common, and it happens even with the Mission Rama. And I defy anybody to find anything negative about a Mission Rama experiences. They have the most dramatic experiences, opening these Zendra portal things and having these program sightings. But they take it as very religious. They're doing praying and oming and meditating, trying to raise their consciousness to come in contact with what they believe are ETs from planet Apu. And so you have these events. And in 2 incidents, one in 2015, it followed the guy home, but the phenomenon does not engage the person that followed it home. It engages the family. So this guy was a translator with Mission Rama. He wasn't even there. He got inside one of these Zendras with this alien, and he was just floored by this thing. He'd never seen a UFO, nothing. He wasn't even there to see that. And he ends up with this phenomena, but it's following his wife around. It's playing with his wife's car, and so the hitchhiker phenomena engages the family. It never really engages the person who caused the situation. So that's where this whole blue orb thing comes from. This kid gets bombarded by these blue orbs, but you got to remember the reflective quality of this thing. The same night, this big briefing took place where they scared the living daylights out of Homeland Security, and this incident at the ranch. The other thing that they talk about, that Jim talked about, that I just go to the theory of wow, is why would the phenomena have a wolf? And again, you have special forces guys who are playing, hunt the skinwalker, and then the skinwalker phenomena, or the intelligence says, oh, you want to play hunt the skinwalker? We'd love to play that game. Oh, we'd love to play that game. And suddenly it turns it around, and suddenly you're the one getting hunted. So you have this event where he says, well, why would this wolf be in the backyard of Axelrod's house and scare the living daylights out of these 2 kids and the wife? And that's the whole thing. It's this reflective thing. You're treating it as a weapon, as military, and of course it's going to appear that way. And the interesting part that I found in there that nobody ever mentions is that the wolf scratches the tree. Now, if this wolf came from Alpha Centauri and flew across its vacuum of time and space and ended up in this backyard, why is it scratching the tree? It's doing the same thing as the triangles on people's arms. It wants to scratch in the tree because they want you to know this is real. This was not a dream. This was not an illusion. And it's playing this game. It wants you to investigate. It wants you to try to track this thing down and figure it out, because in the end you're going to figure it out, and it may take 100 years, but eventually people are going to figure out what's actually going on. Again, here's the triangles. This is my partner, who I wrote the triangle book with, Nicole Sackage. Here's a triangle that appeared on her arm. So why would they put a triangle on her arm? That disappears in a couple of days. Here you even have from the gifting field, one of the gifting fields in New Mexico, where Tim Taylor is there, and they have this metal. This is one of the pieces of metal that they recovered. And here you can actually see a triangle with a circle in the middle. And the question would be, well, why do you need a triangle on a piece of metal? So they're finding this metal, and it's almost like the phenomena is creating these things. They're doing all this weird stuff, and then every single piece of metal is going to be different. Every single piece of metal is going to have some weird thing about it, very high purity. The way it was created, you couldn't create it at that time. Screwing around with the isotopes. They're just doing the theory of wow. They're doing this weird stuff where you go, wow, almost like the encounters in the bedroom or whatever it is. That's all they're doing. They want us to realize something's going on. And as we investigate and study the thing, more and more we learn, the closer we get to the answer. The core story. Jim tells, as many high-level officials do, and I'll eventually, I'm doing a cruise ship thing. I'm gonna talk about what do the high level officials know. So I go through the presidents. I did the presidents for 30 years. I did chase the high level CIA people. I chased Dr. Eric Walker, who was the highest level source that anybody's ever had in the UFO field. This idea comes down to the core story. This idea, UFOs are real. We have hardware, and we really know what's going on. Now, it was first, the core story idea first came from Jacques Vallée, Paul Putoff, and Kit Green, who have had long held security clearances. Kit Green in put off maybe from 1970, 1969. They've had top secret security clearances. And in the 1980s, they get together and say, well, there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of garbage floating around. What do we know for sure? And they came up with this idea that there's a phenomenon that's engaging us. We've got hardware and we aren't doing any very well back engineering this. Now, Jim Semivan has put this forward, and I totally agree with this, that Jim says the same thing. So Jim will take a question for someone about what about the bodies and crafts? And he says quite clearly, because you've got bodies and crafts does not mean you know what you're dealing with. And I totally agree with Jim on this. So I'm going to put some of the stuff that I got from Jim that I thought was very significant. And you got to remember, this is a guy who was briefed. I have met with people who I know are in the know. One of them told me that the truth is indigestible. It is not something that we will be able to fully grasp or entertain. It would be like telling someone about something they can't do anything about. It is world changing. It is so world changing and transformational. That's almost like when Lakatsky made almost the same statement. He said that we've discovered there was no engine. So what are we really dealing with here? And the idea is this thing is going to be 1,000 times more complex than people think it is. It's not going to be simple. Pull the engine out of here. In fact, I going down the route that all the different propulsion series are going to be different. That if you go to Area 51, you go to the 115, that whole story. Has anybody ever told that story? No, it was one guy told the story. And he probably did have an experience with that. And the whole thing is that all the propulsion systems may be different. Lakatsky said all the UFOs are different. All the metals are different. And you start to see the pattern is different than what we thought it was. But this is this whole idea that the thing is so far beyond. The core story is we've got stuff, but we haven't got a clue what to do beyond gathering the metal and material. Now, here's what Jim said. In the very early days of quantum theory in the 1920s and 30s, most of the people who grasped what it actually meant was that we're immaterial, that we are basically an illusion, and that atoms are basically invisible, and that we're just energy forms. Think about that for a second. If that is the case, how would the president present that? And he's implying that this may be what's actually going on here, that it's not as physical as you think it is, which I've been saying for at least a decade. How would a president go on national TV? And I'm sure they thought about ways to do this. They never came to an agreement. They have always come to the agreement that it's probably best not to say anything until we have a better understanding. What the hell do you say? Jacques Vallée, Jim Semivan points out this very funny story where Jacques Vallée puts that basically he said, if you want to know the UFO thing, understand the implications of this thing, go take your cell phone, go out in a field, throw it in front of some cows and have a conversation. We have no clue. I mean, the cow is not going to have a clue what the cell phone is, and we have no clue what this phenomenon is we're dealing with. We may think we do, but in the end, all the high-level officials I've seen are basically saying the same thing. Yeah, UFOs exist, but beyond that, it's pretty much a mystery. I think Jim Semivan says this. I think there is a way that we could sort of locate some dots to later on to connect. Right now, you can say that we have dots. I'm not even sure we have dots because I'm not sure the dots are actually real. And when you have a high level official like that, you got to say, what's he really talking about? It's not really real. The other one he said was there does not appear to be any out there. What's he talking about? He's a high level official. And you start to realize the phenomena is more complex and it is something that we really don't quite understand. He also talked about this disclosure thing that people are all pushing now. Jim Semivan said, I don't expect anything from the government to come out on this. The government exists solely for the defense of the United States and not to be the UFO directorate. That's not their deal. So he said, no, don't hold your breath about the government disclosing. Here's this idea. We think, the government's got all this, they're back engineering this stuff, they're flying these things around or whatever. Well, not according to Jim, who got briefed. Hopefully they find something, a little needle in a haystack, or a signal in the noise that we can start and get somewhere with this before the end of my lifetime, but I am not holding my breath. So anybody who thinks they got it all figured out, Jim Semivan doesn't think so. In conclusion, let me give my opinion of what is going on, what may be going on. The Semivan story illustrates to me that, like many other experiencer stories, there's a deeper meaning to what happened, that we cannot at this point in history completely understand what we are dealing with. Some of the examples that we can look at, the only research that's really around is the free survey, which was done maybe 10 years ago, and the MUFON Kathy Martin study, which basically all come to the same sort of conclusion in terms of percentages. In the free survey, they talked to 4,200 people who claimed they'd had interactions with non-human intelligence. Here are some of the things that sort of match up with this idea that there was something behind Semivan that had this guardian type thing going on about it. The questions that are asked in the free survey, I'll just read this. I believe that my UFO experiences occurred so as to awaken me to the existence of larger cosmic forces which are affecting our lives, and that the ETs play a role in this. 72% agreed to that. I believe that my UFO experiences were arranged or designed by higher intelligence, and that ETs have a role in this. 69% said yes. I believe that there are powerful cosmic forces operational today that are working to spiritualize the planet. 67% agreed with that. Did the ETs give you a message of love or oneness? 54% yes. Did the ETs provide you with a spiritual message? 53% said yes. Did the ETs give you any message about God or a creator? 31%. Was any of this ET communication concerning life after death, heaven, or perceived spiritual world? 28% said yes. Did the ETs give you a message of reincarnation? 26% said yes. Did the ETs give you any information about the death process, about life after death, or the spirit world? 19% said yes. Now, people will object to this and say this is just anecdotal. Keep in mind that everything is anecdotal in the UFO community. This is the only research that there is. So it's 4,200 people versus some skeptics' opinion. Also, in conclusion, I believe that there will be a primary spiritual answer to what's going on. Nuts and bolts are a dead end. The phenomena, I think, is not ET or much more complex than ET. All UFOs are different. All metal recoveries are different. All entities are different. All crop circles are different. And very importantly, the phenomena is reflective. So that if you decide that you're going to play Hunt the Skinwalker, it'll play the game and it will turn back on you. People will say this is nutsy stuff. Keep in mind, in 2012, I and Colin Andrews were the only people who are talking about consciousness, and that consciousness is a key to understanding the UFO phenomenon. Now everybody's talking about it like they invented it. It was only in 2012 when this concept first came up. I also stated in my book, UFO Sky Pilots, that the mind is part of the propulsion system, that the craft is alive, it's conscious. You touch a part of the craft, you become one with the craft, and whatever you think is what the craft does. Keep in mind, I was the first to put that out. Now, James Lukatsky, who ran the Defense Intelligence Agency UFO study and the study at Skinwalker Ranch, has stated for the record that the UFO propulsion is part physical and part psychic. And the last thing I'll sort of put out is that those in charge are mostly in the dark. And I think Semivan and a lot of high-level people will say the same thing. Yes, UFOs exist. Yes, we have films. Yes, we have bodies. Yes, we have crafts. But that doesn't mean we know what's going on. I challenge anybody to take my conclusion here, write it down, come back in 10 years and tell me I'm wrong. I very much doubt that I will be wrong. This is what the data seems to show.